Jim, Ashby, welcome to this conversation this morning. It's very kind of you, both of you, to put some time aside to connect on our project. And so welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Good to be here, wherever here is. Yeah.
Virtually, correct, exactly. So today's topic generally will be the topic of religion, and it's apropos that we're recording it the day after Christmas. So I thought we would start with just a very basic question, as we always do with these conversations, and that is maybe Ashby, to you first, and reflecting on the role of religion kind of in human life, maybe in a basic way. It's been part of human life. It's certainly Western tradition from the very beginning. And you think about that idea, at the fundamental level, what do you think is the role of religion in our lives?
Well, I think there are two ways of answering that question. And the first is to ask it, I think, in the way that is to answer the question that you've asked, the role of religion in the individual person's life. And the traditional answer to that, which I agree with, is that it provides explanation, exhortation, inspiration, and consolation for the different questions of life. I think religion is much broader than that, however, because it comprises whole communities and institutions of people. So I would say that it involves a discourse about transcendence through practice within a community and a broader institution. And that will be, I think, enough to get us going on this conversation. We don't have to talk about the phrase of what constitutes religion. Yeah.
Jim, same question to you to start us off.
Well, it sounds to me as if you were asking Meno, the star of one of Plato's dialogues, when you asked Mr. Niederer, because he's clearly thought about the question and he had a ready answer. I would say that I agree with what he said, though we might differ on the particulars of whether it actually fully does all of the things that he mentioned, like console and explain and exhort, etc., or whether it tries to do that and it does it with varying success.
Jim, we tend to think of religion today and the role that it plays in our lives and in society as if it were always that way. But I would imagine that religion in antiquity is a very different thing. Reflecting on that idea, what do you think are the most important differences? Is what an ancient would have answered that question, maybe?
Well, it depends what kind of person you're asking. In ancient times, nobody doubted the existence of the gods. It was something which was self-evident. And it was self-evident because for a couple of reasons. First, mainly for the reason that Mr. Niederer suggested, namely explanation, because the pagan gods certainly didn't offer much consolation or exhortation, since they were full of the same vices as human beings in general. But they did offer some forms of explanation, and they offered some way of dealing with the world over which human beings could have some success. For example, if you were an ancient person and you believed that you needed to avoid earthquakes, you could make sacrifices to the god of earthquakes, Poseidon, and that gave you some control. If your sacrifices were large enough, then Neptune or Poseidon would keep you safe from earthquakes. So that gave people some control. It also gave them some form of explanation, because if there was an earthquake, you could say, well, it was done by Poseidon. You wouldn't, and so it served those purposes. But if you were to ask a modern religious person, they would pretty much say, they would leave off the part about bribing the god in order to give you what you want, but they would also use God as an explanatory principle. But if you were talking about people who are more philosophical in antiquity, in general, they would have said what I just said, but more scientific people, scientific being the word that we use for philosophical for antiquity, today, some people would have a challenge to their religion, and others would have the same certitude about its truth as the pagans did.
So some things continue, though. Maybe the idea that there is some relationship between the human and divine, right? That seems to be a constant if you're looking at it from the ancient perspective for today, right? That there's how would that?
I think it's exactly the same. The people who prayed to their local deities for protection had the same feeling as people today who pray to saints or invoke God to help them. In that case, it's exactly the same. I don't see what differences did you think there would be?
I remember talking when we talked, I think it was with Roger, who mentioned this idea of in the ancient world of not necessarily owing homage to the gods or obedience, but almost sort of a respect, an understanding of their role in the universe. And I think it's much more than that for most people today. I guess what I had in mind. I'll put the question to Ash. We ask you as you reflect on what Jim is saying, and you think about the differences and how that relationship has changed. What do you see as something, how things have evolved, maybe, or differences?
Particularly how religious practice has evolved from antiquity.
Yeah, maybe that fundamental role that it plays in human life. If it has evolved, maybe you don't think that it has.
Oh, certainly. Well, I think probably the grandest change. I'll say one thing. I don't think that the first psychological explanation that I gave is the strongest definition or explanation of the use of religion, because those are focused on the individual. And we've seen since the Enlightenment that role has changed greatly, the role of religion. You have books like Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, precisely because people are losing their religious faith. And they cease to find metaphysical explanations for things convincing. And so we've been attempting to find meaning out of suffering or out of interpersonal relationships or out of some sense of cultural belonging. Those are the three senses that Frankl gives, at least since the Enlightenment. And I think basically the largest change I see then is that the metaphysical explanations have more or less gone. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And most of modern religion anyway, not in all of it. I mean, there are fundamentalist circles that believe in it, and if you're Orthodox, then you have to accept creeds of the Immaculate Conception if you're an Orthodox Christian, for example, and that's clearly a metaphysical claim and not a scientific or empirical one. But those have largely gone by the wayside.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on that, Ashley? I'm curious. Do you think something has replaced it, or it's just changed to something else, or other aspects have come to the forefront because of that phenomenon?
So do I think that other aspects of religion have been more highlighted or underlined in light of the loss of metaphysics?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Well, to take a biblical definition of religion, and James 1:23, in the New Testament definition of religion, pure religion in the eyes of God the Father is to visit orphans and widows in their oppression, and then to keep oneself undefiled from the world. So the emphasis, I think, has shifted in large part away from the latter and toward the former. So away from the concern about the defilement of the individual, and more, and this is hopeful, toward visiting widows and orphans in their oppression and using your religion in a practical way within your religious community and the broader institution to do good in the world. And I think, for example, the Catholic Church does a pretty good job of philanthropic work and donating its time and its resources towards causes. Now, some of those are very political in their orientation, or maybe could be conceptualized differently, or the resources that go to them could be allocated perhaps better. But they are definitely a large philanthropic organization. I think that's largely due to the emphasis in the Catholic Church on the visiting of the widows and orphans, that practical aspect of religion.
Jim, any other thoughts on that? There's always been this balance maybe in the big religions between practice and belief, no?
I disagree with Mr. Niederer on a few points. I think that the religious Christians that I know, and particularly Catholics that I can think of, do believe in the things that he said are metaphysical and no longer matters of belief. They still believe in the Immaculate Conception, and many believe still in transubstantiation. And I'm thinking of a chemist that I knew when I participated in a Templeton seminar on science and religion in Oxford, named Arthur Peacock, who was a chemist. He was a noted chemist, and he was able to reject all of the views of Christianity that depended on faith, except for the incarnation, which he said was not incompatible with science, and he accepted it. And I think he accepted it for psychological reasons, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to call himself a Christian, since this was a fundamental Christian view. So I don't know. I'm surprised, but Mr. Niederer is more up to these things because he went to Princeton Seminary. Is it true that there they no longer subscribe to those what you call the metaphysical parts of religion, of Christianity?
Well, personally, I have the same psychological problem that your chemist friend does. I think that there are certain elements of Christian doctrine that just have to be believed if you're to be a Christian, or else you water down the definition so much. But yes, I mean the trend appears to be toward the rejection of those claims. I had friends in seminary who claimed to be Christian atheists, which seems
that would seem to be an oxymoron,
right.
no?
And I said that, to them, but
probably you should have given them the etymology. It means pointedly stupid, you know.
Okay.
It's like accusing Socrates of making new gods but being an atheist. You know? You know, this is the charge against him in the apology.
Perhaps it meant that they admire Christ, the historical figure, no, without believing the religious
Well,
superstition.
how would they be different then from Unitarians?
But saying that they are, I just proposed that maybe that's what they meant, that they.
Well, I don't know, but I think that Mr. Niederer, as a student of the history of religion, much more than I, and especially of Christianity and Protestantism, would say that that's a heretical view for most Christians.
Yes. So yeah, I certainly would say that. Unitarians at least still have a soteriology, and they have an eschatology, a belief in some afterlife. Now, most Unitarians are Universalists, believing that everyone will eventually be saved and reunited unto Christ in their view, and that's not a belief at all for the atheist, you know, who just believes that you should have as much hope as you can in this life and move on from
Don't
there.
you suppose that that's not even the hope of most Christians who believe that people have to belong to the kind of Christianity that they belong to in order to be saved? That's why I think Catholics would condemn most Protestants to hell, and most Protestants would certainly condemn Catholics to hell, to eternal damnation. Maybe some things have changed since Vatican II, but I was just talking to a very good friend of mine who is in Bologna, who is very angry at Pope Benedict for having said that there's a commonness to Islam and Catholicism, and he was just furious that that my friend, who had been twice knighted by the Italian government, he was furious with the Pope for giving some kind of acknowledgement to Islam. You know?
Mhm.
So I think confusion, the modern world has perhaps confused, mixed things up, but probably maybe in a healthy way, because I mean, people who are struggling with the spiritual issues come from all over the place and have all kinds of views which are probably incompatible. Remember, the ancients thought all the religion, at least the common people thought all the religions were equally true.
That's right.
Joe, I wanted to go back to something you said, and that was about belief. This is just a general question. Is it possible to truly believe something we don't understand?
Well, I could answer that.
Yeah, please.
I'd like to see what how Mr. Nieder disagrees. I think if you truly understand something, then you have knowledge, and if you have knowledge, that's not compatible with belief. Belief is a lower form of cognitive acceptance, and
Is belief something then on the way to knowledge, or an alternative?
it could be, but it doesn't have to be. For instance, if you believe that if you are taught that the Earth is flat, you'll never reach knowledge that the Earth is actually not flat. And but if you believe that a triangle has three sides, then you might be on the way to learning more facts about geometry.
So if you believe something, that doesn't necessarily mean that you know it. It just means
No, you can believe plenty of things that are false.
Okay.
All right, and I think you would agree. No? And but if you know something, at least in my use of the word "know," it must be true. It must be like one of the solutions in logic or geometry. You know, so that you have no doubt about its truth. And in fact, no doubt is even possible if you've understood the premises and the steps of logic.
And
actually one question to you. Can you believe something without knowing it to be true?
No, I see the same logical conundrum that Dr. Arieti has, but I would ask him whether you think that something that's not essentially empirical can be true. For example, a psychological truth.
Well, what kind of thing would you have in mind as a psychological truth?
Well, so throughout virtually all religions in antiquity, there was some idea that in order to make life meaningful, one had to accept the suffering that it entails willfully and to bear that burden.
I think that's a view that we find in biblical religions. It's not a view of pagan religions.
You don't think so?
No, where do you see that? I don't see any figures of paganism in any of the epic poems or lyric poems. The Stoics certainly didn't invoke gods, and they believed that one should endure suffering, but it wasn't religiously motivated. It came from not being able. If you can't do anything about something, you have no choice either to except to commit suicide or to endure it. They recommended enduring it.
Certainly. Well, let's take the example of Egyptian religion and Osiris, Isis, and Horus. So Horus was killed by his father Osiris, and then resurrected by his mother. And it was only in his mother's acceptance of the suffering of her own death and descent into Hades that she was able to resurrect Horus, who became the archetype for the Egyptian pharaoh. And so that suffering is why she is praised as the divine feminine within that religion. That's an example. Yeah.
Okay, it's hard for me to understand those myths without studying them, especially the phrase "divine feminine." I I don't know what that means. It sounds like a romantic idea of Goethe, who talked about the eternal feminine.
Right.
I'm not sure that I know what it means.
Okay.
It seems a poetic way of phrasing things. I think that that when you said that religion comforts, I think you had to be talking about religion as it's been practiced, at least the biblical religions, but it doesn't have to do with it has something to do with the metaphysical substrate of the religion. If your reason for being comforted is either that you think that you can't understand the bad thing that's happening to you because you're only seeing a small part of the picture, but God sees the big picture and so he sees how it fits in, or you think, well, I'm suffering in this life, but I'll be rewarded in the next life. And those people who get away with their crimes and live high and mighty in this life, they will be punished justly in the next life. And in that way, it could be comforting. But both of those depend on faith. No, either that that the punishments in the next world are just, or that God sees the big picture and you only see a small part. So your suffering really isn't evil. It's part of the good that's in God's plan. Was I clear enough?
I think so. So you're saying that comfort can be had, comfort can be had within religion, but given the metaphysical substrates of religion.
Yeah, I think it depends on the existence of a God who intervenes in affairs in this world, and certainly determines the condition of your soul in the next. Don't you?
I agree. I totally agree. And just to be clear, I think that exhortation, explanation, inspiration, and consolation can be had without religion. I was arguing that those are, and in fact, Richard Dawkins makes a really good case in his God delusion for those being had outside of religion. That's the classical argument, the psychological argument for what religion does for the individual. I think a grander argument is what religion could do for the world, and it's been an instrument of meaning making for at least the last 2,000 years with the Catholic Church. And I think you're right. A lot of that meaning depends on metaphysical claims, which is precisely why people are becoming maybe more and more disillusioned with religion and disappointed with it.
Yeah, but I think that the good for the world would be clearer if we all adopted the pre-biblical view that is attributed to most ancients in the non-biblical lands, that all the religions are equally true. But once they're developed religions that claim to be the only way, the only road to heaven, or the only way of truth, and lots of different religions made that same claim, then it was, how could you know, really? How could you know? You had to take on faith that whatever religion you happen to have, even if only a few people in the world shared it with you, that you would be saved. I think that view that God would create human beings with the capacity to reason and would allow them to believe that they were the sole recipients of divine revelation would be like a father or parents who had many children and said to each one of them, I'm revealing the truth to you. And then to another one, I'm revealing the truth only to you, and to a third and fourth one. And how could they determine what it was with no standard outside of that father who is giving those rules? That's a problem that I see in the biblical religions. And I'm not the only one. I mean, the great thinkers in the Middle Ages tried to reconcile philosophy and their religion to show that their religion was completely compatible with philosophy. None of them succeeded.
Tim, when you think about the students you've had and how so much of your uh, let's say attempt is to take on the Aristotelian sort of perspective on the good life, right, and being and the role of logos and reason to attain, say, the maximum potentiality of a human being. Do you think that being religious in whatever the form is, generally speaking, is compatible with that? It's an aid to that? It's a hindrance? When you've had very religious students in your class, have they been easier to teach or harder?
Well, I've had some religious students who refused to investigate even the Bible because they said they understood it and they knew what it meant, and they were careful to use the word "knew what it meant." And when you ask them for an argument, they said you can't argue about the text. You just have to feel it. But I think that when it comes to the metaphysical parts of religion and views that really depend on faith, it's very difficult to say that this religion is true and this one is false. But when it comes to ethics, I think that many of the religions agree. They would be like Stoicism and its opposite, Epicureanism, which came to the same ethical conclusions about how you should lead your life. And I think that's true. I think there's not a bit of difference between Judaism and Christianity when it comes to how to lead how to lead a good life. And
I guess to me the challenge is if you read Aristotle's The Ethics, it doesn't require a higher power to attain the goals that are set within it. Right?
no, it doesn't make any claims that are based on faith. And Aristotle, when he describes the kind of God that his philosophy yields, which is done in book 10 of the Metaphysics, and it's thought thinking about itself, that's not a kind of God that anybody can pray to or relate to. And it's just a philosophical guess. And he doesn't say that what he's saying is the truth. It's just something which is logically consistent. And I think that that those religions which stress ethics, which is apparently what they're now doing in the modern world, Mr. Nieder, I think that's what he said. And they're focusing on helping the poor and doing other good things and being charitable. If all the religions did that and didn't weren't like my Italian friend who was so angry at Pope Benedict for giving some credit to Islam, then wait, no, what's the name of the current Pope? Francis.
Mhm.
That's the Pope that I meant, and he was angry. Scratch everything that I said about Benedict. It all refers to the current Pope, who just a few weeks ago made these remarks that caused quite a bit of controversy in Italy. And I wish
lots of people are mad at Francis. So you think good.
Pardon?
I said
Yeah,
lots of people are mad at Francis. So
right.
Friends and good.
I'm not one of them. I'm not mad at the Pope John the 23rd either. Yeah, though a lot of people were mad at him too. I'm
Actually,
sorry.
kind of returning the same topic to you as you think about the Aristotelian definition of the good life and its what role for you if you were to accept that as kind of the ultimate end state for a human being. I'm not saying that you do, but if you did, what role does religion play within that construct?
It's an excellent question. I would say that there's been attempt after attempt, screed upon screed against religion, and they have really wonderfully scathing critiques that I think are very powerful. In fact, Dr. Arieti recently advised that I stop reading so much Nietzsche. and sent me a different book instead. Um, the issue I have with the ethical systems that are set up by those, take Nietzschean ethic, where you have to. It's, man, we can't just do a big sweeping history of philosophy without some background here, but you can't become the Ubermensch by yourself. No man is an island. And if you're a Kantian, you can't, I don't think that you can truly follow the categorical imperative by yourself outside of any context of community or accountability. That's accountability is a weak word for what I'm looking for. Outside of some institution or group. I mean, we've evolved as a species to work within groups together and to work toward common ends. And that doesn't mean that the institutions that are set up are therefore the best possible institutions, or that the religions that exist are necessarily true, are equally true, or that one of them is true.
Mm-hmm.
But it does mean, from the perspective of ethics, it's really hard to set up your own system, and many people have done it, and then to enact that independently. That's the role I think religion plays. It gives you a system. There is symbolism around birth, marriage, and death. There's a community who's there for you, and it's really hard to act that ethical, to act ethically outside of that, to pursue the good outside of that, I think. And I would love to hear an argument to the contrary.
I want to endorse your view. I think what you said was very good, and it speaks to human psychology.
Sure.
One can be persuaded by Aristotle's ethics, but that is not something that can be part of a celebration of a wedding or of a birth or give you much comfort at the time of the funeral of somebody that you care about. And religion does give one organized activities, and it gives one a community in which they share the same holidays and do the kinds of things that make our lives wonderful. You know, I think that is true. I think it would be nice if we had some religions. I think there are religions. I think really the basis of many religions, which in their ethical components are not different from what Aristotle or even Socrates says. You know, that we should aim at justice and never do wrong, things like that, and never requite wrong with wrong. Those are views shared by many religions. At least many religions give lip service to that kind of ethics. When you can combine that with the communal parts of religion, you'd have something really great.
Aren't you doing the same thing you criticized the Princeton people for, of reducing it to practices or context or ceremonies or ways of marking the calendar, if you say that's its principal goal? In other words, the Aristotelian life is complete. However, there's nothing wrong with a holiday to celebrate Act A or B or the spring or the end of the year, or, right, that it had, or a wedding or a death or a birth. They're just nice. There's some nice things to have in addition to this sort of core philosophical status.
Whom are you addressing?
You, Jim, because it sounds like you said you criticized the Princeton people perhaps reducing religion to practice, but now you're saying that there are these very nice practices that are.
No, I wasn't criticizing them for that. In fact, I thought that was a positive step.
Okay, understood. Mm-hmm.
I think that you asked whether it was possible to know things.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is possible to know things, but the number of things that you can actually know in the strong sense of know, which means from causes and not a posteriori, but that which means from effects.
Mm-hmm.
The number of things that you can you can know absolutely are very few, and none of them concern the faith claims of religion. And I think it's a mistake. I believe I follow Socrates in thinking it's a mistake to claim to know things which you can't know. And I think it was one of the achievements of the Catholic Church, in fact, of Thomas Aquinas on the question of the eternity of the world, which he worked on for a very long time. He even wrote a book on the eternity of the world. And his conclusion is that the Catholic Church shouldn't say that the world either came into being or is eternal, because that's not something that science can answer. And if we make a claim about the eternity of the world and it later turns out to be self-contradictory or have some defect, it'll cast doubt on the whole Catholic faith. And I thought that was a legitimate conclusion to reach, that we just can't decide on that issue. And if Aquinas had applied that to many other things, it would have been even better. So that's what I have to say about that.
I ask you different questions for you. One of the interesting arguments I read in favor of religion was an evolutionary one time, which was that if it weren't necessary, or there weren't some truth to it in some way, that evolution would have eliminated it along the way. It must play some basic biological function, right, in human life.
It does.
Mm-hmm. To either one of you, any thoughts on that argument? The best argument for religion is that if Darwin is right, it would have been eliminated from our lives a long time.
No, I don't think that evolution helps in the way that religion, the human mind, as Aristotle says, desires to know. Human beings, by nature, desire to know. But the number of things that we can know are very small. And the human mind is restless until it has a feeling that it understands the causes of things. And religion, by making the gods the causes of things, certainly for ancient peoples, gave them a sense of knowing, and or at least of understanding the world. Well, the gods created the earthquakes, Zeus makes it rain, and that's all you need to know. And I think that helped bind communities together, and it gave people comfort that that the world wasn't really mysterious. It was ruled and controlled by gods.
Ask me your thoughts on, let's call it, the evolutionary role that religion has played over time.
Well, I think we first need to decide whether we're arguing about truth or utility. Religions may be useful, and they clearly are because they've stayed around this long. I think that's true, but evolution aims to propagate our genes, not to lead us toward truth in a scientific sense. So we could see this if you point to anything that exists that doesn't seem to be precisely true, any belief or system that exists, like say some communities still practice ritualistic animal sacrifice. Maybe we don't think that that's true or good or moral, but it helps propagate that particular community within its context. But that doesn't have to deal with truth, in my opinion.
Actually, let me ask a different question, and that's changing topics to theology, if not religion. Curious at what you see as the purpose of the study of religion, right, as an academic field, as distinct from the study of religion as a practice or phenomenon.
So how would I distinguish theology from religion?
Yeah, sort of what is the purpose of theology? I'm curious.
Well, to reason about God.
And I'll tell you a story. We can edit this out later, but there was on a plane flight one time I sat next to a theologist, and we were joking around on the flight, and I said, isn't it kind of a contradiction that you have theology that is a study of religion? How can you apply that? And he told me this joke. He said the reason there's theology is that if you tell 1,000 people there are 10 commandments, 999 say, great, how do I get started? And one will say, well, why aren't there 11? So there's always that one person wants to know, why aren't there 11? And that's what theology is for.
Yeah.
You
So
think that's
why aren't there 11 Ten Commandments? Yeah. Well, that was like, it reminds me of one of the colleagues that we have who teaches a subject that's not Western, Asian history, and he argued that the Western culture course was Eurocentric, too Western centric, and it seems like complaining about the Ten Commandments that they're not 11. That a course about Europe would be Eurocentric. One could have said that his class was Asian centric, but
maybe there's that thought. There's always people who want to understand not just what the thing is, but why. So why are there 10 and not 11? Why is it that God appeared at this point? Why did this was
there are actually 630 commandments. It's just that the first 10 are
first, and the rest didn't make the list.
and you can ask, why are there 630? Well, the rabbi said because there's 630 seeds in a pomegranate. So you could ask, why didn't they pick some other fruit with a different number of seeds? Well, you'd have to ask them or God.
Yeah, just your thoughts on theology as distinct from religion, kind of the role that it plays.
Well, I think one needs to be careful with pursuing theological studies too deeply too soon. I think the Jewish faith does a good job of preventing people from studying Ecclesiastes until you're 40. I think, and Ezekiel until you're 40, at least in some Jewish faiths. Because as Solomon would tell us in the endless pursuit of books, there's endless pain, which makes some sense. Religion I've defined earlier, or attempted to give a definition of earlier, but yeah, theology is reasoning about God. It's the dealing with the particular aspects. Trinitarian theology is at the center of most Christian faith. I think Orthodox Christian faith. And it's reasoning about God and how he orients himself toward the world, and typically that's been done in the Christian faith through the apophatic method, saying things that God is not. So he's immaterial, etc. So that's theology, whereas religion has to deal, I think, more with practice. Yeah.
Yeah, I like to say something about that word orthodox. Which Mr. Nieder, I think, used correctly when talking about Christianity. It means ortho is the word for right, and doxa is the word for opinion. And but it doesn't really have to do with acting. That would be a different word, orthopraxis, which is from which we get the word practical. And in Christianity, especially the Christianity I'm more familiar with is through the Middle Ages. Not that it stopped developing then, but that's just the part that I've studied more keenly. And it really did deal with orthodox. So if your views weren't quite right about, say, transubstantiation, you would be burned at the stake, as Thomas Cranmer experienced at Oxford, because his views weren't quite orthodox about transubstantiation. And that would be true of the Trinity and so on. But in Judaism, the word orthodox is used of people who obey all the rules of kashrut, and they eat this and that, and they don't do this and that, and they shave in a certain way. But none of that has to do with belief. It has to do with actions, and they really should be called orthopraxis. Judaism traditionally doesn't require any beliefs. You don't even have to believe in God. You're not supposed to deny God, but you don't have to believe in him. And if we think of many of the great Jewish books, including the Talmud, we find people arguing with God all the time. But doxa, or belief, is not a requirement of Judaism. but it has traditionally been a requirement of Christianity, and different sects require different beliefs.
Jim, if you say that you don't even have to believe in God in Judaism, is there some other metaphysical imperative that
Sorry?
is there another metaphysical imperative that is applied, or is it more a practice or a state?
No, I think there's a famous anecdote about Rabbi Hillel, who was a famous rabbi around the time of Jesus, and his big enemy was intellectual enemy was the Rabbi Shammai, and these are the two most often cited in the Talmud. And somebody came to a proselyte came to Rabbi Shammai and said, "Will you teach me Torah, which is the Jewish law, while standing on one foot?" And Rabbi Shammai said, "This is an impertinent question. Go away. I don't want to have anything to do with you." And then he came to Rabbi Hillel and asked the same question, "Will you teach me Torah standing on one foot?" And Rabbi Hillel said, "Yes, absolutely. The essence of Torah is don't do to others what you wouldn't want them to do to you. Everything else is commentary." And so what Rabbi Hillel was doing was putting the essence of Torah in its ethics, and not in its rules about this or that.
Do you think, Jim, that maybe at the end of the day, everybody, because we can't all know all the things that are supposed to be known, typically speaking, about a religion, that as people craft their own individual version of Catholicism or Judaism or even Islam, that ultimately it's just a reflection of who you are, this belief system you carry with you.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be so terrible either. People would say, "Well, I can't read the mind of God, so so long as you don't, eat children and make that a sacrament in your religion, or other really unethical, anything that's unethical, I would say just fine." And we should be tolerant. Really, it would be a sign of humility, which is a Christian virtue, to be humble and not presume to know what God wants us to do. But I'm curious to know what Mr. Niederer thinks.
About what in particular?
Actually,
Well, about the place of accepting the religious views of those people whose religious views are different from our own.
Oh, about religious toleration. Yes. Yeah, that's I think the Jewish community does that better than the Christian, because we do. The Christian community, as you said, requires certain metaphysical beliefs, and among those, among the beliefs required is that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and none shall come to the Father except through Him. That there's no other name given among men through which you must be saved. And so these are claims that make one less than ideally tolerant toward other faiths.
isn't there a distinction, Ashley, between, because religious tolerance seems I have to put up with it, whereas it's distinct from religious acceptance, that there might be other ways of getting to the same place.
Right. I do think that those are different things. Were you asking me to distinguish them?
What I was asking Jim was this idea of, because it's impossible for anyone to be fully cognizant of all the, let's say Catholicism, there's no way the average person would really understand all the subtleties and concepts of what it means to be Catholic. So they will pick and choose the things which resonate the most to them. So doesn't everyone eventually create their own version of Catholicism or of any religion on a daily basis?
I think so, and I think that's why even a catechized Catholic or a catechized Orthodox Presbyterian probably couldn't relate to you the Trinity without committing some sort of heresy, without saying something incorrect. And if we were still living in the Middle Ages, then people would be being burned at the stake left and right for that fact. And yeah, so we craft our own religion, but partly by virtue of the fact that there's so much that you're required to believe. I mean, if you just look at just the catechism, the smaller catechism of the Catholic faith, I mean, it's a book that's 600 pages long, and it's hard to memorize all of that, you know,
Mhm.
especially by the time you're 12, which is when you're expected to know it.
But do you think that God really wants people to use their brains in memorizing the catechism, which, you know, is still added to? There is, you know, I remember asking a Catholic what he thought about, say, abortion, and he would say, "Well, I don't know. I'll go look it up in the catechism, and I'll tell you what I believe." And so there was no independent thought, or he wasn't thinking about it one way or the other. And there is no catechism in Judaism. You don't have to, you know, you're not required to believe anything. But I thought that was. I hope that wasn't true, because I well, I've known Catholics who were very thoughtful and very argumentative, and uh, but but there might be something to it if you're required by the age of 12 to memorize the catechisms, and somebody asks you, what do you think about capital punishment? You just remember what the catechism tells you.
Jim, I'm curious, as reflecting on your career, um, and your life, what role does Judaism play for you, either as a scholar, as an educator, someone who's been an influence in so many young people who spend time with
Well, as you might be able, if you know, I subscribe to the ethical principle stated by Rabbi Hillel, and I don't try to persuade people to become Jewish. I don't try to dissuade them from any religion that they have, but because I don't deal with those except in the history classes, where it's important to understand if you want to understand the Roman Empire, at a certain point you need to understand the conflicts even within the Catholic Church or within the church about various issues. Um, but I have taught the Hebrew Bible in the humanities course and in Western culture, and I've encountered sometimes some students who won't look at the text and read it as a text, but those have been very few over the years. But even those students, I was distressed that they couldn't look at the text as we look at it in Western culture, uh, as a text that is to be studied and analyzed, uh, which is the way the philosophical Christians and everybody else looked at the text. I mean, one of the great works of of uh, of the Middle Roman Empire or late Roman Empire are the works of Augustine, the commentaries of Augustine on Genesis. They may be full of notions that you think are crazy, but nevertheless, they were exceedingly influential, and it's important to understand them for understanding our own culture.
asking me the same question to you before we wrap up is, as a scholar, as a student of theology, what role does religion play in the academic side of
In the academic side of my life,
it? Yeah. Mhm.
well, academically, I study it all the time. So it plays that role. And I think if we're speaking strictly about an academic effect that religion's had on me, I think it's part and parcel of the fundament of Western culture. That's really important to understand if I want to understand myself and those around me. So that's a great academic role of religion, I think. Yeah.
But Ashley, listen, we're almost out of time, and as you know, we've recorded these conversations in honor of Jim's last year as a professor at Hampden-Sydney, as an active professor. I'll put it that way. Any reflection on your time with him as a student and since then that you'd like to share before we wrap up? Question for you, Ashley.
Oh, the question's for me?
Yes, I was saying that we recorded these conversations in honor of Jim's last year as an active member of the faculty at Hampden-Sydney. And so any reflections on your time here as a student and since then, really a friend of
Sure,
Jim.
sure. Yes, I've given this some thought. I think I ended up taking at least one course per semester with Dr. Arieti, and he was the only professor with whom I took at least one course. I took more courses with him than with any professor in my major, any individual professor in my major. And I think the reason is that he was willing to challenge me a lot on my beliefs and on my arguments, and not scared to give a bad grade to bad work and a good grade to good work. And those were wonderful things. I think we could tell a number of anecdotes, but I'll distill it down to the fact that he was probably more than any other professor just willing to challenge me on things that I held dear.
Mhm. Seems like you guys have stayed in touch since graduation.
Sure.
Continue to be not just the former student and teacher, but also friends.
Well, hopefully so. Yeah.
Jim, any thoughts before we sign off?
Well, Mr. Nieder was one of the students with the most alegria, which is an Italian word that means mirth and good cheer and optimism of those that I've encountered in my career. He was a pleasure to have in class when he was actually interested in a topic, paper topic. It would be evident from the paper that he wrote that he really enjoyed writing it. And so he didn't have to go kicking and screaming into every paper, or write it reluctantly as a burden, but he took on many of those topics some of the topics as a joy. And he wrote very creative papers, and he was a delight to have in class.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, I'll pause the conversation. Ashley, thank you for your time today. Jim, as always, thank you for your time.